The search began as justice, and ended as theater. By the second night, every road, every swamp path, every ferry port in St. James Parish was crawling with men carrying torches. But what they hunted wasn't Evelyn Duval. It was silence, the kind that follows when power has something to hide. The sheriff's men said they found tracks near the cane fields, a man's boot prints, a woman's slipper. But when the rain stopped, so did the evidence. The next morning the report changed. The prints were indistinct. The page after that was missing entirely. In the courthouse, Gerard Duval handed over a sealed envelope and requested that discretion be exercised in all record-keeping. That phrase, still visible in the archives, is how you bury a scandal in plain sight. Within days, new testimony appeared from witnesses no one remembered seeing. They described Henry Carter as unstable, given to violent outbursts, and obsessed with his mistress. Convenient words, printed word for word in the Baton Rouge Gazette 3 days later. But beneath that public script, something else was unfolding. Sheriff Thomas Wilkinson's private notes, the ones discovered decades later, tell another story. He wrote that Rachel Evelyn's maid had confessed that her mistress was planning to leave weeks before the disappearance, that she had sewn coins into her corset lining, that she had whispered to Henry by the river when the thunder comes. That testimony was stricken from official records. The sheriff himself ordered it removed, likely under pressure from the parish council, men who shared Duval's dinner table, his profits, and his politics. They didn't need the truth. They needed control. And so the story was rewritten. The runaway became the villain. The wife became the victim. And the husband, the man who may have discovered their plan, became the wounded nobleman. But secrets rot faster than corpses in Louisiana soil, and sometimes when institutions try to erase something, they only make its shadow darker. 'Cause not everything burned in that house fire 2 years later. Some things survive when they shouldn't, letters sealed in walls, voices caught in the damp wood of old books. And what those fragments whisper isn't about abduction. It's about awakening. 2 years after the disappearance, the Duval house burned. The official record called it lightning. But old men in St. James Parish would shake their heads when they told it, saying the sky was clear that night, and that lightning doesn't strike twice in the same spot without a reason. They said the blaze started in the library, the same room where Evelyn read forbidden books, where Henry built her shelves with his own hands, where ideas once whispered had turned to conspiracy. That's where the fire began, as if the house itself was trying to swallow what it couldn't cleanse. When the flames died, the parish came to gawk. They said Gerard Duval stood barefoot in the ashes, silent, holding a single object in his hand, a page blackened by heat. Servants said he wept, but not for his wife. They said he wept for the humiliation, for the story that would never stay buried. But something did survive the fire. Not the house, not the ledgers. A single box, metal, sealed, and hidden behind the ruined hearthstone, found a century later during a renovation in New Orleans. Inside was a small leather journal, burned at the edges, but still legible. The inscription read, "Property of E.D." The handwriting trembled, the ink bled, but the words were sharp enough to cut through time. He speaks of Rousseau, of liberty, of the rights of men. I tell him that none of it was meant for us, not for women, not for slaves. He smiles and says freedom must be stolen, not granted. That thought has followed me like a fever. These weren't the words of a woman possessed or abducted. They were the diary of a mind breaking free, one thought at a time. And perhaps that's why Gerard burned it all. Not to destroy his wife's memory, but to prevent others from catching the same sickness. Because ideas are more contagious than rebellion, and when a master's wife and a slave begin to share one idea, freedom belongs to no man, the world they live in begins to collapse from within. The fire didn't erase her. It only made her immortal. They found the final pages fused together, ink melted into the grain of the paper like a confession the fire itself had tried to swallow. But heat has a strange mercy. It blackens what it cannot destroy. When restorers in New Orleans pried the layers apart under lamplight, the words emerged like whispers rising from a tomb. October 6th, 1839. The thunder did not come, but he did. Henry says the boat waits by the cypress bend. I can hear the frogs calling like bells. If I falter, it will not be fear. It will be pity for what I leave behind. The house, the silence, the perfume of rooms I never breathed. I would rather die than live in that stillness again. Every sentence felt deliberate, ritualistic, a preparation, not an accident. There was no plea for help, no mention of abduction, only resolve. And one final note scrawled sideways in the margin, trembling but defiant. If the river takes us, let it take the lie with us. That phrase became the riddle of St. James Parish. The Duvals had built their fortune on lies, on a family myth of honor and civility that covered the machinery of human suffering. Evelyn had seen it from within the walls, had watched her husband trade flesh as though it were cotton, and Henry, born into that system, became both her reflection and her rebellion. Together they planned not escape, but exposure. Some say the journal's missing pages contained names, ledger codes, even letters from abolitionist contacts in New Orleans. A network hiding in plain sight, using the plantation's own trade routes as arteries for something far more dangerous than smuggled goods, information. But somewhere between that midnight and dawn, the river claimed them both. No witnesses, no bodies, just fragments of linen caught on driftwood, and the scent of smoke that hung for days. And yet, one unanswered question lingers in every historian's throat. If the fire came 2 years after she vanished, who returned to burn the house? Because the handwriting on the journal's last line was not Evelyn's. It was his. "Forgive me, my love. The thunder has come." The handwriting was the key. A firm, deliberate script, nothing like Evelyn's graceful loops. The archivist who first examined it in 1912 noted that the final sentence appeared written with a different ink, the kind manufactured in the 1840s, not 1830s. That meant only one thing. Someone had written in her journal after the disappearance. But who? In the summer of 1843, a plantation foreman near Natchez claimed to have seen a scarred mulatto man working under a false name. Buckner said he carried a small brass locket and refused to speak of where he came from. One night during a thunderstorm, the foreman found his cabin empty, the bed still warm, the locket left open. Inside was a tiny, faded sketch of a woman with pale eyes and a crescent moon earring. Evelyn Duval wore those earrings in every portrait. The story spread quietly, then vanished under clerical indifference. But the church heard it. In 1845, Father Jean Lafond of St. James Parish was summoned to New Orleans under urgent diocesan inquiry. His surviving notes, found in the Jesuit archives in 1954, record one cryptic confession. "He came to me with trembling hands. He spoke her name as one speaks a prayer, said he had buried her when no man would find her, and that she was not dead when the river took her. I was told to burn the page. I did not." The church never named the penitent, but the initials H.C. appear faintly beside the entry, written in Lafond's distinctive shorthand. From that point onward, all reference to the Duval case vanished from parish records. No mass for the dead, no public statements. It was as if the church had been instructed to choke the story at its root. But truth doesn't die. It festers. By the late 1800s, whispers of the Cypress lovers spread through Louisiana folklore. A woman who walked a riverbank when thunder rolled, searching for the man who had broken her chains, and a man who dug her grave but could never fill it. What the priests couldn't destroy became myth, and what began as sin began to sound like scripture. Because sometimes the heretic and the believer are the same soul, split in two bodies, each carrying half of the truth. In 1854, a woman named Celeste Bernard walked into the St. James Parish courthouse claiming she had seen Evelyn Duval. Note, Herr Ghost, Herr, flesh, voice, and eyes that shone like stormlight. The clerk who took her statement dismissed her as delusional. But what she described wasn't madness, it was memory preserved in ritual. Celeste was a midwife, one of the few black women allowed to travel between plantations under the guise of healing work. Her testimony, buried for nearly a century, surfaced in a sealed envelope during an estate sale in 1932. The pages were brittle, but the words bled through clearly enough to make a historian's hands shake. "She came to me by the Cypress Bend," Celeste wrote. "The thunder was rolling, though the sky was clear. She wore a white dress heavy with mud, and her hair was loose as river moss. She told me she'd been under for years, that she was carried there by a man who loved her more than God." Celeste swore she didn't dream it. She said the woman touched her cheek, left her fingers damp, cold, and smelling of ash. She said the fire could not kill her, that the church had sealed her name in iron, but the river had freed her voice. When Celeste returned home and told the story, something happened. The slaves who heard her began to sing a new version of the Thunder Hymn, this time with a name. Evelyn became Evelyn, the spirit who rose from the river to lead the lost north when storms broke the horizon. They sang of her footprints glowing on wet soil, of her voice calling men to wake in the night and walk. That year, 3 plantation uprisings coincided with violent thunderstorms. Each began after midnight. Each left the overseers swearing they'd heard a woman's voice echoing through the storm, calm, commanding, promising freedom on the other side of thunder. The church labeled it pagan delirium, but the parish whispers said otherwise. Evelyn Duval had become something more than a ghost. She was an omen. And the code that began as love had turned into a prophecy, one that could no longer be contained by scripture or chains. By the late 1850s, the story of Evelyn Duval, or Thunder Bride, as she had become known, had grown beyond legend. It was no longer whispered in fear. It was organized, deliberate, and dangerous. Across St. James Parish and beyond, small groups of enslaved people began using her story as a blueprint. Her journal became a manual in secrecy, her coded phrases a map of movement. When the thunder comes was no longer just a warning. It was a signal to gather, to hide, to escape. Hidden compartments in sugar barrels, false walls in barns, and secret river routes became arteries of a resistance network no overseer could detect. Men and women who could read, who had memorized her letters, passed instructions in the form of poetry or hymn. A single misinterpreted line could mean freedom or death. The masters tried to respond. Gerard Duval had long been gone, but his allies remained: the parish council, the church, the merchants who profited from the same system that had enslaved Henry Carter. They launched investigations disguised as legal audits. Houses were searched. Pregnant rumors were documented as mental instability. Leaders disappeared without record. Yet the Tanda breed network persisted. Stories of a white woman and a skilled black carpenter moving unseen through swamps became coded folklore repeated in hushed tones over centuries. The enslaved didn't just remember, they immortalized her as a symbol of impossible defiance, a lesson embedded in rhythm, song, and silence. The trail that began in Louisiana disappears briefly, like a river diving underground, only to resurface in Philadelphia. In 1847, months after Evelyn and Henry vanished, a marriage certificate surfaced under new names, Ellen Davis and Harold Carter. The document was straightforward, formal, and official, yet the annotations tell a hidden story. The officiating minister wrote in a private ledger, "She speaks with a southern accent despite claiming Charleston birth. Husband protective. Watcher's door, fear evident." Even in freedom, they were not safe. The Fugitive Slave Act hung over their heads like a storm cloud, every northern street and wharf a potential trap. Henry established a small carpentry business in Philadelphia's 7th Ward, operating quietly, blending into the free black community. Ellen, once Evelyn, became a shadowed figure in her own life, cautious, alert, acutely aware that every smile in the street could hide a pursuer. But there were moments of defiance. A letter later recovered in city archives described a stolen afternoon walking along the Schuylkill River. "We are alive," Ellen wrote. "Not the same as we dreamed, but alive. And the world will not erase us yet." Yet even in the North, whispers of them reached back south. Louisiana papers published false sightings, rumors of capture or death, stories designed to scare the enslaved into obedience. Gerard Duval, now in France, continued to monitor, via intermediaries, the legacy of his lost wife. The plantations could not forget, and the system of power, the one that had defined every boundary of their lives, refused to release them completely. Freedom was never simple. It was a constant negotiation between visibility and invisibility, between identity and survival. Every document, every ledger entry, even a casual mention in a newspaper, carried the potential to betray them. And yet, their existence in Philadelphia proved something extraordinary. Even under the weight of systemic oppression, calculated pursuit, and social erasure, human agency can endure. Theirs was not merely survival. It was an ongoing act of rebellion, a quiet revolution lived in daily acts of vigilance, love, and intellectual pursuit, a life constructed in defiance of the expectations that had sought to imprison them, not just in body, but in history itself. And history, as we know, is rarely impartial. It is written by the victors, the planners, the enforcers, but sometimes fragments, a journal, a ledger, a fragment of a marriage certificate survive. And through those fragments, the truth whispers, and bonds, no matter how absolute, can be broken. The threat wasn't just physical. It was ideological. Evelyn's flight, her deliberate erasure of her own life under her old name, challenged every pillar of authority, the church, the plantation, the law. She demonstrated that freedom could not be legislated, purchased, or policed. It had to be stolen, shared, and protected. What the planters didn't realize was that by erasing her from official records, they made her more powerful. She became a story that could live in secret, shaping minds and daring souls to question their masters, a spark that could not be extinguished. By the time the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 hardened the legal chains, the Thunderbride's legend had already infiltrated New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and even the hidden networks of free black communities in the North. She had created something bigger than escape. She had created an idea that could not die. And it all began with a single act of defiance, a woman choosing love and freedom over the weight of her chains, and a man brave enough to walk beside her into the storm. Philadelphia was meant to be sanctuary, but sanctuary under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was a fragile illusion. Iver street corner, iver harbor, iver stranger kult be an agent of the law or warse as peen for the old masters. Evelyn and Henry, Ellen and Harold now, lived carefully, but even the smallest misstep could return them to the chains they had fled. City directories track Harold's carpentry business until 1853. After that, they vanish. The marriage certificate offers no further clues. Letters, tax documents, and parish reports trail off like smoke in the wind, and yet whispers in free black communities hint at a northward migration. Some say they took the Underground Railroad not south to Baltimore, but north toward Canada, across a border that the American law could not penetrate. This disappearance is no accident. It is methodical, deliberate, the work of two people who had learned the art of erasure from necessity. Every trace left behind, every record, is either false or incomplete. The system hunts them, but they become ghosts in plain sight. No one in the South would risk reporting them. The legend had already taken hold, and fear is a powerful tool. Even historians have struggled to trace them. Archival searches in the 1960s in Canada uncovered hints, land purchases under assumed names, references in abolitionist letters, faint mentions in black community records, but nothing definitive. And every time a trace appears, it is as if someone has preemptively deleted it. A ledger entry gone, a letter missing, a record never filed. It is in this deliberate disappearance that the Thunderbride myth gains its deepest power. To vanish under law, under history, under society itself, requires the same courage that allowed a woman to flee a plantation under the eyes of an entire parish. It is an act of pure agency, a rebellion so complete that it erases the very narrative of ownership. What remains is only legend, fragments, and coded whispers. But even in those shadows, her story teaches escape is more than movement. It is transformation. It is the rewriting of history from the margins. And every time we think we have lost her, Evelyn, the Thunderbride, reminds us that history can be bent, rewritten, and stolen back, one life at a time. Decades after the fire that consumed the Duval mansion, the plantation lay abandoned, reclaimed by swamp and cypress. By 1966, archaeologists surveying the site made a discovery that would rattle every assumption about the disappearance. Beneath the charred ruins of the main house, they unearthed a root cellar, hidden beneath overgrown vines and mud, untouched for more than a century. Inside were 3 items, each unremarkable in isolation, yet together forming a silent testament to defiance. A woman's pearl hair comb, unmistakably 1840s, a carpenter's measuring tool, initials scratched into the handle HC, and fragments of a letter addressed to "My dearest E." The letter, waterlogged but partially legible, spoke in urgent coded language. Lines like, "Cannot delay any longer. He suspects. Today he would sooner see you dead than April 7, 1847. These words were written only days before Evelyn vanished. The final fragment suggested planning, secrecy, and a sense of imminent danger. They were not the words of a frightened victim. They were the words of someone anticipating a confrontation, someone ready to act. But the most chilling revelation was the physical space itself. Archaeologists noted signs of intentional concealment, a cavity carefully walled off, dirt packed to obscure access, and the faint outline of what might have been a small ladder or trapdoor. It was as if someone had intended this cellar to be invisible, a hiding place for ideas, plans, and perhaps people. For the first time, history offered proof beyond rumor Evelyn and Henry had not disappeared randomly. Their disappearance was calculated, methodical, and executed with precision that left physical traces. The fire was no accident either. It had erased the surface while leaving a hidden layer for those with knowledge to uncover. These artifacts reframed the narrative entirely. Evelyn was not a passive figure in history. She was a strategist, a participant in her own liberation, and the evidence demanded acknowledgement of her agency. The fragments refused to lie. Her story was deliberate, subversive, and dangerous. Even today, visitors to the swamped ruins report sensations of cold, a whisper of wind through the cypress, and the faintest hint of smoke. Some claim to hear a woman's voice, calm and commanding, whispering a single warning: freedom is stolen, and its price is vigilance. The Duval Plantation was not merely a house of wealth, it was a laboratory of control. Every ledger, every schedule, every whispered order functioned as a psychological machine, conditioning obedience, fear, and resignation. Gerard Duval had perfected it over years, the threat of punishment, the illusion of benevolence, and the invisible surveillance embedded in every corner of the estate. Evelyn understood it the moment she arrived. Her letters to her cousin reveal a house where even the air seems to obey the master. Every servant, every field hand, every shadow moved as if synchronized by an unseen conductor. This was no accident, it was a system, a network of power designed to crush autonomy. Yet Evelyn did not merely endure. She studied. She observed patterns, traced behaviors, and mapped vulnerabilities. The man she had come to know as Henry Carter, literate, intelligent, and strategically minded, became her partner in a silent war. Together they turned the plantation's own mechanisms against itself. The accounting ledgers, overseer reports, and disciplinary notes were not just records, they were a playbook. Henry learned which messages could travel unnoticed, which rooms were blind spots, and which schedules offered cover. They communicated in marginal annotations in books, a system invisible to the untrained eye. Every minor request for books, every small movement of goods became a coded rehearsal. The master, Gerard Duval, unwittingly facilitated it. His obsession with order and control became a blind spot. He failed to recognize that Henry's familiarity with the household, combined with Evelyn's social knowledge, allowed them to anticipate his movements. The very tools of domination, ledger entries, staff rotations, and household privileges were repurposed into instruments of liberation. This was not chance. It was psychology in practice. Evelyn understood that control could be observed, analyzed, and inverted. Every act of seeming compliance was a deception, every feigned obedience a mask. And in that subtle, quiet manipulation, freedom was crafted, a dangerous knowledge that few would ever grasp until centuries later. The lesson is stark. Systems of power are not absolute. They are predictable, malleable, exploitable, and in the quiet observation of weakness, in the patient anticipation of patterns, the oppressed can turn the tools of their oppressors into instruments of their own liberation. Every act of preparation on the Duval plantation was a calculated illusion. To the outside world, Evelyn packed her small valise casually, gradually, over days, a method that seemed innocuous to the inattentive eye. But each item carried significance. A book here, a piece of clothing there, letters folded within pages, instructions embedded in margins. Nothing was random. Everything was a signal. Henry Carter's role was equally precise. He managed the library, oversaw minor repairs, and handled household logistics, all positions that offered him access to the plantation's inner workings. He carved small notches into furniture, marked discrete symbols in corners of rooms, and left invisible breadcrumbs for Evelyn to follow. These markings were the heartbeat of their escape plan, invisible to any overseer but perfectly legible to the trained eye. Communication became an art form. They developed a system of coded annotations in books by Voltaire, Rousseau, and obscure philosophical texts, works that Gerard Duval prided himself on owning but rarely read himself. Margins contained dates, times, and coordinates. Words and sentences were swapped, emphasized, or crossed out to signal shifts in movement or readiness. Every book was a message, every shelf a map. Even the enslaved on the margins of the plantation played a role. Not all, but those who could read the subtle cues, who understood whispers and gestures. Rachel, Evelyn's maid, became an unwitting participant. She stacked books in deliberate order, moved minor objects as instructed, and carried verbal messages phrased as innocuous chatter. Each act appeared mundane, yet it reinforced the chain of secrecy that allowed the pair to remain unseen. And yet, the most daring aspect of the plan was psychological. By manipulating Gerard's assumptions that Henry's fixation on literature was harmless, that Evelyn's quiet demeanor indicated compliance, they used his trust as camouflage. The system that was meant to imprison them became a shield. Every expectation, every rule, every ledger entry worked in their favor if interpreted correctly. The precision was staggering. One misstep could have been fatal. But by synchronizing observation, deception, and coded communication, Evelyn and Henry turned the plantation into both prison and a stage, the perfect trap for a master's assumptions and the perfect launch pad for their disappearance. It is here, in the quiet manipulation of perception, that the brilliance of the Thunder Bride emerges. Not brute force, not chance, but the mastery of hidden systems turning control into freedom. April 10, 1847, began as any other day on the Duval plantation, but by dusk the air thickened with foreboding. Dark clouds rolled across the Louisiana sky, winds rattled the shutters, and a heavy rain began to fall. The plantation's usual rhythm, overseers calling out orders, enslaved laborers finishing chores, the cook preparing the evening meal, continued under the illusion of normalcy. Evelyn and Henry had waited for this moment for months, timing their departure to coincide with factors beyond their control but ultimately in their favor. The master's absence, the chaos of the storm, the natural cover it provided. Gerard Duval had left for New Orleans that morning, expected back in 3 days. His ledger entries, meticulous and oblivious to rebellion, offered a blueprint for their timing. By 8 p.m., Evelyn requested tea in the library, a routine that concealed the most extraordinary act of defiance in the parish's history. She and Henry moved with calm precision, leaving no sign of urgency. The storm outside masked the sound of their preparations, the packing of essentials, the movement of coded messages, the careful placement of their trail. Every act was deliberate, every gesture calculated. Denn der Rhein fell harder, hammering against the mansion's roof, drumming on the riverboat. It became a shield, drowning out footsteps, voices, and the subtle creaking of floorboards as they made their final movements. Henry guided Evelyn through hidden passages known only to them, passages carved by observation, maintained in secrecy, and rehearsed over months. They reached the river landing under the cover of torrential rain. A small vessel, arranged in advance through contacts in New Orleans who were sympathetic or complicit, waited to carry them downstream. Witnesses later reported seeing a white woman and a black man board quietly, her dark veil concealing her face, his hand steady on the tiller. They spoke little, their movement silent yet resolute. By dawn, the storm had passed. Evelyn and Henry were gone. The plantation remained, drenched, chaotic, unaware that the very systems it had built to control them had been outmaneuvered. Gerard Duval's return 3 days later would trigger a search unprecedented for St. James Parish, but it was too late. The Thunder Bride had already vanished. And with her disappearance, the legend truly began. Not a tale of abduction, not a story of crime, but a narrative of mastery over a system designed to enslave. That night the storm did more than mask movement. It symbolized the violent, unpredictable force of liberation that history often attempts to erase. When Gerard Duval returned from New Orleans, the plantation felt off-kilter, drenched and empty in a way no storm could account for. Henry was gone. Panic rippled through the estate and out into the parish, igniting a manhunt that would become one of Louisiana's most notorious. Newspapers seized the story immediately, crafting a narrative designed to protect the social order. Respected planter's wife, abducted by a Negro man. Reward offered for her return. Headliners screamed outrage. That every account framed Henry as a criminal, Evelyn as a victim, and the system itself as righteous, threatened by chaos. The reward, $1,000, wasn't just incentive. It was a signal that the law would back the master's version of reality. Search parties scoured the swamps, the roads, the riverbanks. 50 men with bloodhounds tramped through night-soaked marshes, shouting her name into the fog. Notices were posted as far as Natchez and Mobile, yet despite the massive effort, nothing concrete surfaced. The river yielded no bodies. The roads produced no footprints. And then the contradictions appeared. Rachel, Evelyn's lady's maid, gave a statement to authorities noting that her mistress had been packing gradually over several days, a deliberate preparation, not an act of coercion. Parish records later struck her words from official files. Sheriff Thomas Wilkinson preserved them privately, yet they were ignored in public discourse. Even local observers noticed inconsistencies. Riverboat captains reported seeing a white woman and a black man traveling together, calm, composed, and purchasing passage to New Orleans. One captain's statement stands out no more than any woman traveling with a man. She did not seem in distress. Yet the newspapers, the sheriff, and Gerard Duval himself insisted on the abduction narrative, weaponizing public fear and the racial hierarchies of the South. The truth that Evelyn may have chosen to leave, that Henry may have been a willing partner, was systematically erased. Any suggestion of agency was buried beneath layers of legal authority, social expectation, and the plantation's long shadow of control. This early battle between narrative and reality is crucial. It reveals that power is not only physical, but psychological. By framing Evelyn as a passive victim, the elite preserved their control over the story, over memory, and over the moral framework of the parish. The very act of fleeing became criminalized, transformed into an instrument of fear. Yet even in the midst of this orchestrated deceit, fragments of truth endured, whispers, statements, coded letters, reminders that history is not monolithic. There is always a shadow, a countercurrent, a hidden path through which the oppressed can speak, if only we know where to listen. History often presents Evelyn's disappearance as sudden, spontaneous, a panicked flight in the dead of night. But the parish records, letters, and marginal annotations reveal a far different story, one of meticulous planning, patient observation, and cold calculation. This was not desperation. This was strategy. Surviving fragments of her correspondence, hidden in private family collections and later recovered, describe small, deliberate actions over months. Books were requested not for leisure, but to serve as communication vessels. Clothing and personal items were packed incrementally each day, leaving just enough normalcy to avoid suspicion. Even meals and household rituals were co-opted into rehearsals, their movements disguised as routine. Henry Carter's role was equally strategic. The ledger entries show him reassigned to field duties, then returned to library management, a pattern dictated by Evelyn's insistence, and a subtle signal that the timing was approaching. Each reassignment was a test. How closely were they being watched? Could small deviations be executed without triggering suspicion? They learned patience, waiting for the perfect confluence of opportunity, the master's absence, the storm, the cover of routine. Even the smallest gestures held weight. A mislaid book, a moved chair, a notched table, each was a signal, a key in a coded system that only the two of them understood. The plantation's very infrastructure, the schedules, the hierarchies, the blind spots and oversight, became their tool. Every oversight by the master, every predictable behavior, was exploited. Letters from Evelyn reveal a psychological clarity rarely recorded in the enslaved narratives of the period. She understood the stakes. One misstep, one misinterpretation, and their lives would be destroyed. Yet she also understood the power inherent in choice, the ability to act decisively, even under the most suffocating systems of control. Her strategy was audacious, not because it was reckless, but because it was precise, deliberate, and above all grounded in the meticulous study of power itself. What emerges from these documents is a portrait of cunning and audacity. Evelyn and Henry were not merely fleeing oppression. They were executing a plan that leveraged knowledge, observation, and psychological manipulation. They transformed a plantation, a machine designed to dominate, into the stage of their liberation. This is a lesson few recognize. Systems of control can be read, understood, and inverted. And the true brilliance of the Thunder Bride is that she did not merely escape. She taught the art of subverting authority itself, quietly, invisibly, but permanently. The Mississippi River is a living entity, vast, unpredictable, and capable of swallowing entire histories beneath its dark currents. On the night of April 10, 1847, it became both shield and accomplice. Evelyn and Henry, cloaked in darkness and veiled by torrential rain, embarked on a journey that would mark the first irreversible step toward freedom. The riverboat captain's later testimony is haunting in its simplicity. A white woman and a black man boarded quietly at a small landing, spoke little, and maintained distance from others. Yet in those gestures lies the subtle defiance of a meticulously executed plan. Every movement, measured and silent, ensured that the narrative of abduction remained unchallenged for decades. They traveled downstream toward New Orleans, the city that represented both danger and opportunity. Each mile on the river was a negotiation with fate. The storm masked their passage, but it also mirrored the chaos of their lives, a relentless, consuming force that demanded awareness, courage, and timing. They moved as shadows within shadows, avoiding scrutiny while remaining acutely aware of every pair of eyes and ears. New Orleans was not a haven. It was a crucible. A city of commerce, secrecy, and transient populations. It offered anonymity, but also risk. Evelyn and Henry had to navigate not only the physical environment, but the invisible map of social hierarchies, racial surveillance, and informal networks of informants. One wrong word, one casual glance, and freedom would slip through their fingers. Yet the first steps in the city's teeming streets were calculated. They secured temporary lodging under assumed identities, established contact with sympathizers, and began to craft their new lives. Every purchase, every interaction was a test, a rehearsal of living unseen, of existing without trace. They understood the delicate balance between visibility and invisibility, between caution and action. The Mississippi had carried them physically, but New Orleans demanded mastery of a different kind, social invisibility, strategic patience, and the discipline to act as if they were ordinary, even while rewriting their destinies. It was here that their partnership solidified, not just in love or necessity, but in skill, cunning, and a shared understanding of the rules they had learned to manipulate. In the shadows of New Orleans, the Thunder Bride and her ally were no longer fugitives in the sense the South imagined. They were agents of their own story, shaping reality through observation, calculation, and quiet audacity, a pattern of resistance that would define the rest of their journey. New Orleans was a city of contradictions, wealth and poverty, freedom and oppression, visibility and invisibility. For Evelyn and Henry, now Ellen and Harold in their new personas, it was both refuge and test. Every interaction, every transaction, every casual glance had the potential to undo months of meticulous planning. They lived in plain sight, yet without trace. Lodgings were rented under assumed names. Purchases of clothing, food, and books were calculated to avoid suspicion. Even their speech, accents, vocabulary, mannerisms, was adapted to blend into the urban environment, masking Southern origins that could betray them. Wer Detail mattert. Identity was not merely what they presented, it was what they withheld. Connections mattered as much as concealment. The couple relied on sympathetic networks, free black communities, abolitionist contacts, and discreet allies who understood the stakes. Letters carried coded instructions. Word-of-mouth alerts allowed them to navigate the city without detection. Trust was selective, granted only after careful observation. They understood that freedom in the South required allies, but freedom in the North demanded caution. During these months, the duo crafted a version of themselves that could survive scrutiny. Henry's carpentry skills provided a cover. Commissions, small repairs, discreet labor that allowed them to earn without revealing their true circumstances. Evelyn's knowledge of literature, culture, and society became a shield. She could interact with strangers, perform the social roles expected of women, and yet remain untraceable. This period in New Orleans was more than survival. It was training. Every day was a rehearsal for the next phase of their journey, the migration toward Philadelphia. They honed their ability to observe patterns, anticipate risks, and move unseen. The city's labyrinthine streets, bustling ports, and transient populations became their classroom. They were learning how to exist between worlds, neither fully visible nor fully invisible, mastering the art of strategic disappearance. And through it all, the river remained a silent witness. Its waters had carried them from the Duval Plantation. Now its tributaries and ports offered passage north toward a city that promised anonymity and possibility. Every step forward required discipline, foresight, and courage. Von Miskalkulation and the Law Informants Kult ervase Progress. In this crucible, the Thunder Bride's transformation became complete. Evelyn was no longer a woman fleeing oppression. She was a strategist, a master of systems, and a force capable of bending circumstance to her will. The erasure of their past was not loss, it was power. The journey north was fraught, yet deliberate. Evermile carried them farther from the shanks of the South and deeper into the creation of a new reality. Evelyn and Henry had become Ellen and Harold, names chosen not for whimsy, but for strategy. Each syllable, each identity was a shield against pursuit, a declaration of autonomy. Philadelphia was no stranger to fugitives, free black communities, and networks sympathetic to the oppressed. But it was a city of observation as much as opportunity. Every step required discretion. Boarding houses were chosen carefully, away from curiosity and rumor. Streets were navigated with an acute awareness of those who might ask questions. Any misstep could have undone everything. They began to establish roots immediately. Henry's carpentry skills became both livelihood and camouflage, allowing him to interact with the world while remaining untraceable. Ellen, leveraging her literacy and cultural knowledge, navigated social spaces with poise, crafting an image of ordinary life while concealing an extraordinary past. Their survival depended on performance as much as discretion. Critical to their permanence was legality. On October 3, 1847, city records show their marriage under their new names. The officiating minister noted details that would later spark scholarly fascination. Ellen spoke with a Southern accent despite claiming Charleston origins, while Harold's vigilance at the door suggested a deep awareness of possible threats. This ceremony was more than personal. It was a formal, legal assertion of existence, a transformation codified on paper. Tax records and city directories reveal further strategic choices. Harold established a small carpentry business in Philadelphia's 7th Ward, a community known for free black residents. The business operated without incident for years, indicating both skill and careful management of visibility. Every document, every record was a calculated step in reinforcing their new identities. Yet even in freedom, shadows lingered. They lived with the knowledge that the Fugitive Slave Act loomed on the horizon, that legal and extra-legal forces could destroy their constructed lives at any moment. Their actions in Philadelphia were not reckless celebrations. They were calculated continuations of the strategic genius that had guided them from the Duval plantation, through storms, rivers, and cities, into a new existence. Theirs was a victory of intellect, courage, and patient observation. In transforming their identities, they had mastered systems of power, evasion, and survival. They became more than fugitives. They became architects of their own fate, walking among society as invisible forces rewriting the rules of life, liberty, and identity. In Philadelphia was fragile. Ellen and Harold had created identities, livelihoods, and a small circle of trust, yet the shadow of the South stretched far beyond its borders. By 1850, whispers of the Fugitive Slave Act began circulating, a law that would make even northern cities dangerous for escaped enslaved individuals and those who had aided them. Every document, every step, was now a potential trap. The act was a weapon of fear, designed to extend the reach of slavery into supposed safe havens. Any person accused of being a runaway could be seized and returned to bondage, often with no trial, no recourse, and no compassion. For Ellen and Harold, this was no abstract threat. It was a clear and present danger. Their carefully constructed lives could be obliterated by a single accusation, a single misidentified gesture, or the malice of someone loyal to the old order. They responded with the same precision that had guided them from Louisiana. Every transaction, every appearance, every interaction was scrutinized for risk. Their business in the 7th Ward became a tool of camouflage, mundane and credible. Friends and neighbors became allies, subtly informed, carefully chosen. They moved within the city as if part of the ordinary rhythm of life while preparing contingencies for the extraordinary. Canada emerged as the ultimate sanctuary. Word of safe routes, sympathetic guides, and communities beyond American law offered a lifeline. Plans were quietly drafted, possessions reduced, travel routes memorized, alliances cultivated. The same skills of observation, patience, and strategic deception that had guided them through the swamps, rivers, and streets of New Orleans now guided every decision. Even in this tense uncertainty, their psychological mastery remained intact. Ellen and Harold understood that fear itself could be weaponized by the oppressor. By controlling their own perception, by limiting exposure, and by anticipating threats before they manifested, they preserved freedom in both mind and body. Their awareness became a shield. The Fugitive Slave Act forced them to confront a profound reality. Liberty is never guaranteed. It is earned through vigilance, strategy, and the relentless pursuit of opportunity. Those who understand the mechanisms of control, the laws, the social structures, the hidden networks of power, are capable of navigating even the deadliest of systems. And so the Thunder Bride and her partner prepared for a final, decisive move. The North offered freedom, but Canada promised permanence, the elimination of every shadow cast by Southern oppression, every threat encoded into law. The journey was not over. It had merely shifted into the next phase of survival, strategy, and ultimate autonomy. The journey from Philadelphia to Canada was the final, most dangerous stretch of their odyssey. Every mile north was fraught with invisible eyes, potential informants, and the looming power of the Fugitive Slave Act. For Ellen and Harold, this was no longer a simple flight. It was a calculated march toward sovereignty, a deliberate erasure of all traces that might tether them to the plantations of the South. Travel required both precision and patience. Routes were chosen to avoid roads frequented by authorities and were carefully vetted, and guides were selected for their discretion and loyalty. Supplies were minimized, belongings that could betray their past were left behind. Even conversations were coded, gestures substituted for words, every interaction a test of control. They were ghosts in motion, unseen yet deliberate, their vigilance sharpened by years of prior planning. The physical crossing was mirrored by psychological transformation. Names were shed as though they were shackles. Evelyn became Ellen. Harold became a man defined not by ownership or imposed identity, but by self-determination. Every document filed, every lodging secured, every introduction made reinforced a narrative they controlled. These were not escapes, these were constructions, deliberate, strategic, irreversible. Canada represented more than safety. It was absolute sovereignty. Once across the border, the law of the United States could no longer reach them. The Fugitive Slave Act's shadow ended where Canadian soil began. Here, the enslaved could live as autonomous beings, free from capture, free from the surveillance of Southern interests. It was a promise that had guided every step, every coded signal, every calculated risk. Even after settlement, Ellen and Harold understood the precariousness of existence. Their survival depended on the same principles that had guided them from Louisiana: observation, patience, and the mastery of systems. Communities were chosen carefully, trades cultivated quietly, and networks of trust maintained with discretion. Freedom was not a single moment, but a continuous practice, an ongoing assertion of agency in a world designed to strip it away. What emerges from this final leg is a lesson in mastery. Oppression can be navigated, circumvented, and ultimately neutralized, but only through knowledge, patience, and strategy. Ellen and Harold did not merely flee. They transformed every system around them, turning constraint into freedom, danger into opportunity, and fear into calculated power. Theirs is a story of audacity, intellect, and the irreversible reclamation of life itself. History is rarely linear. It is a palimpsest overwritten again and again by those in power. The story of Evelyn, Ellen, and Henry Harold was deliberately obscured, erased, and sanitized by newspapers, plantation records, and societal expectation. Yet fragments endured, hidden in letters, journals, tax rolls, and oral traditions, waiting for those willing to read between the lines. In 1958, workers renovating a townhouse in New Orleans discovered a sealed tin box embedded within a wall. Inside was a water-damaged journal, its pages partially legible, revealing a voice that contradicted every official record. The journal spoke not of abduction, but of deliberate planning, mutual trust, and the quiet audacity of defying the systems built to constrain them. It described coded signals, strategic departures, and conversations with contacts in Philadelphia, fragments of a life reclaimed against impossible odds. The discovery reignited scholarly interest. Historians sifted through parish records, ledgers, and old newspapers, searching for corroboration. Letters from Evelyn to relatives in Virginia, previously dismissed as idle complaint, now revealed the method behind her movements. Notes hidden in book bindings, statements preserved by enslaved staff, and entries in neighboring journals all hinted at a carefully orchestrated escape, rather than the sensational abduction propagated by newspapers of the time. Even oral histories preserved by descendants of the enslaved offered insight. Martha Johnson, born into bondage on a neighboring plantation, recalled her grandmother whispering two versions of the story, the one told publicly about abduction, and the one whispered privately about deliberate planning, clandestine communication, and the evasion of discovery. These oral fragments suggest a deeper intelligence at work, one that history had attempted to erase. By piecing together these remnants, a clearer portrait emerges. Ellen and Harold were not passive participants in their destiny. They were architects of freedom. Each fragment, each coded note, each journal entry becomes a thread in a tapestry deliberately hidden for decades. They reveal the intersection of strategy, courage, and knowledge, and the ability of individuals to subvert the mechanisms of control long before modern understandings of resistance. The lesson is stark. Power controls narratives, but cannot entirely erase truth. What survives, even in fragments, challenges the versions of history written by those invested in maintaining order. And for those who seek knowledge, who study systems of control, and who understand the subtleties of subversion, the hidden story of the Thunder Bride offers a blueprint, a demonstration that even the most oppressive structures can be read, understood, and ultimately outmaneuvered. Power does not always manifest through action. Sometimes it operates through omission. Evelyn Duval, patriarch of the Plantation, presents a chilling study in control through narrative. While newspapers, search parties, and public opinion constructed a story of abduction, every subtle detail suggests he may have known more than he revealed, and deliberately allowed the myth to solidify. The parish records, superficially mundane, contain anomalies. Ledger entries describe disciplinary measures against Henry Carter, then sudden reversals under the mistress's insistence. Minor administrative notes that might have revealed Evelyn's preparation were conspicuously removed from official logs. Publicly, Duval played the role of wronged husband. Privately, he appears to have maintained access to intelligence about their movements, exploiting the confusion to protect his reputation. Consider the reward notices. By offering $1,000 for Evelyn's return, Gerard projected outrage, but he also guaranteed attention to a story that framed Henry as a criminal and Evelyn as a passive victim. The legal machinery and the press were enlisted as tools, shaping public perception while diverting scrutiny from the possibility that she had left voluntarily. It controlled the lens through which the world viewed the event, a master of indirect power, preserving social order while letting others chase shadows. Even the riverboat testimony is instructive. The captain reported that the pair spoke little and appeared calm. This contradicted the abduction narrative. Yet Gerard's public statements ignored these inconsistencies, letting rumor and fear fill in gaps. The story of kidnapping became more credible than the inconvenient truth of voluntary escape. In doing so, Duval transformed uncertainty into authority, allowing society's own biases to enforce the tale. This episode illuminates the subtle mechanisms of control, the manipulation of narrative, the curation of evidence, and the exploitation of societal expectation. Gerard Duval may not have physically captured them, but by shaping perception, he exercised a form of power that rivaled brute force. He demonstrates that control is not always about coercion. Sometimes it is about the orchestration of belief, the cultivation of fear, and the deliberate silencing of inconvenient truths. For modern observers, this is a warning. History is rarely objective. The records, the newspapers, the official accounts, all are instruments of power, often hiding as much as they reveal. Understanding who controls the narrative and why is the first step in uncovering what truly transpired. Decades after the disappearance, a few fragile remnants of the Duval saga surfaced. Letters, journals, and small artifacts, each telling a story that official records had worked so hard to suppress. These fragments reveal not only a daring escape, but also the profound intimacy of a strategic partnership, forged in the crucible of oppression and secrecy. Among the most revealing finds were fragments of letters addressed to "My dearest E," discovered in the ruins of the Duval Plantation's root cellar. The letters, charred and water-damaged, convey meticulous planning, coded instructions, and a profound understanding of risk. Every sentence was deliberate, every omission intentional. They reveal how Evelyn and Henry communicated under surveillance, using subtle signals embedded in everyday objects, book placements, ledger annotations, and personal effects to coordinate their movements without detection. It becomes clear that their relationship was as much tactical as it was emotional. Trust was not assumed, it was earned and constantly tested. Each assignment, each coded gesture, each seemingly innocuous action served as confirmation of loyalty and alignment. In a world where miscalculation could mean death or capture, mutual understanding was the ultimate form of power. Artifacts discovered alongside the letters, a carpenter's measuring tool engraved with Henry's initials, a pearl hair comb matching Evelyn's style, and fragments of personal books illustrate the intersection of intellect and action. The tools of labor, love, and literacy became instruments of liberation, transformed from ordinary objects into vessels of strategy. Each item embodies a duality, functional in appearance, revolutionary in purpose. The letters also expose the calculated patience required for freedom. Instructions for timing, movement, and evasion show that they understood power as a system, not merely a force to resist, but a structure to be navigated, manipulated, and ultimately subverted. Their correspondence reads as a blueprint for survival, a masterclass in leveraging knowledge, observation, and discipline to rewrite one's destiny. This discovery forces a reconsideration of the historical narrative. The public story of abduction, sensationalized and simplified, obscures the deeper truth that two individuals, systematically observing and manipulating every variable in their environment, could outmaneuver entrenched systems of control. In doing so, they did not merely escape. They redefined what was possible under the weight of oppression. Even after decades, the Duval Plantation refused to release its secrets. The story of Evelyn and Henry became something beyond mere history. It transformed into folklore, whispered among enslaved workers, neighbors, and later generations. The swamps and cypress groves of St. James Parish held their narrative like a secret pulse, one that could not be fully eradicated. Residents recalled fleeting glimpses of figures along the river path, a white woman and a black man walking hand in hand at dusk. Their movements were deliberate yet cautious, as if the eyes of an invisible authority lingered. These sightings blurred the line between reality and legend, yet the consistency of details over decades suggests more than mere imagination. People remembered the veil Evelyn wore, the close proximity she maintained to Henry, the careful avoidance of prying eyes. Such fragments, repeated over generations, became encoded as cautionary tales, stories of audacity, love, and the audacious claim of freedom against impossible odds. Oral histories add texture the official records could not provide. Martha Johnson, born into slavery on a neighboring plantation, recounted her grandmother's stories of clandestine planning, notes hidden in books, secret signals, and a constant surveillance that made each movement a gamble. These were not simply tales of romance or adventure. They were manuals of observation and strategy, preserved in memory and communicated with gravity. Each whisper reinforced the notion that control could be circumvented, that oppression could be navigated with cunning and courage. But even the landscape itself seemed complicit. The swamps, bayous, and backroads became a theater of secrecy, allowing shadows to move undetected. Hunters, neighbors, and overseers may have glimpsed movements they could not interpret, moments they would forget or misremember. Yet these natural corridors were integral to the escape, reminders that geography can be an ally when wielded with intelligence and patience. These stories, suspended between fact and legend, persist as echoes of defiance. They reveal that human memory, especially within oppressed communities, becomes an archive of resistance, preserving truths that official records sought to erase. For those willing to listen, the whispers from the cypress groves of St. James Parish teach a vital lesson. Freedom is not only fought with force, but with strategy, awareness, and a profound understanding of systems of control. The Duval story might have remained buried in obscurity if not for discoveries in the mid-20th century. In the 1960s and 1970s, archaeologists, historians, and renovation workers uncovered fragments of evidence that reanimated the tale, forcing scholars to confront the deliberate erasure of a remarkable escape. Among the most tantalizing finds was a water-damaged, leather-bound journal hidden within the ruins of a townhouse in New Orleans. The journal's pages were barely legible, yet the surviving passages offered a voice that defied the official narrative of abduction. It spoke of careful planning, coded communication, and deliberate manipulation of those who believed they held authority over Evelyn and Henry. Here, in fragile ink and paper, one glimpsed a meticulous strategy that had guided their flight from Louisiana to freedom. Equally revealing were the fragments of letters addressed to "My dearest E," found alongside other artifacts in the Duval Plantation's root cellar. Charred and broken, these letters confirmed that the partnership between Evelyn and Henry had been forged in secrecy, strengthened through shared intelligence and trust. They coordinated movements, anticipated risk, and employed everyday objects as signals, a testament to their understanding of the systems designed to enslave them. Every detail, from book placements to ledger notations, became a tool in the architecture of freedom. The final legible lines of the journal are particularly haunting. They speak of a hopeful yet precarious future, the intention to begin new lives under new names, to live free, and to preserve evidence of their truth in the event of separation or capture. Even in its damaged state, the journal radiates purpose and calculation. It is not a record of panic or desperation, but of deliberate, strategic liberation. These artifacts forced historians to reconsider decades of accepted accounts. The public story of abduction, the sensationalist headlines, the court filings, all concealed a narrative of intelligence, courage, and autonomy. Scholars realized that what survived, scattered fragments, charred letters, whispered oral histories, formed a coherent, albeit incomplete picture. Two individuals defying societal, legal, and racial constraints through observation, strategy, and unwavering partnership. The lesson is stark. History can be manipulated, records can be sanitized, and power can dictate narrative. Yet truth, especially when encoded through intellect, planning, and courage, has a way of resurfacing. For those willing to look, the lost journal and the cryptic letters reveal not just an escape, but a blueprint for outmaneuvering oppressive systems, a whisper across centuries that mastery of circumstance is possible. Crossing into Canada was more than a geographical transition. It was a psychological and social recalibration. Ellen and Harold entered a world where American law could not reach them, yet freedom did not equate to complacency. In this new landscape, survival depended on blending in while exercising complete control over the information others could access. Every interaction became a strategic choice. Canada offered sanctuary, but it demanded vigilance. The communities that welcomed fugitives were tight-knit, bound by shared experience and mutual protection. Ellen and Harold learned quickly which doors to knock on, which tradespeople to trust, and which social networks could provide resources without exposing them to risk. Their previous mastery of observation, patience, and subtle signaling was not abandoned. It was sharpened. Harold's carpentry provided both livelihood and camouflage. His work allowed him to move through society unnoticed, a skilled tradesman whose presence drew no suspicion. Ellen, leveraging her literacy and refined upbringing, engaged selectively with local society, offering assistance or companionship when safe, while maintaining the discreet persona of a woman of ordinary status. Together, they created an ecosystem of safety, one that allowed them to live publicly but invisibly within a hostile world that could still reach across borders. Their correspondence with allies in the United States and the North was carefully curated. Notes were coded, letters often routed through intermediaries. Each message was a calculated risk, balancing the need for information with the imperative of security. Even in freedom, their lives were defined by strategic awareness and ongoing negotiation between visibility and concealment. Over time, Ellen and Harold established a routine that reinforced autonomy. Community ties were cultivated for utility rather than social desire, personal possessions minimized to reduce vulnerability, and habits developed to ensure that no trace of their past could be exploited. Canada offered permanence, but only if the discipline of secrecy and strategy remained intact. This period of life reveals a profound truth. True freedom is not merely the absence of physical chains. It is the mastery of one's environment, the ability to navigate unseen threats, and the creation of conditions under which autonomy can thrive. Ellen and Harold did not merely survive, they engineered a sustained existence in which the power of others could no longer dictate the terms of their lives. They became living examples of strategic liberation, turning invisibility into armor and observation into sovereignty. Ellen and Harold's story did not end with their arrival in Canada. It evolved into a legacy that extends far beyond their personal survival. Their journey is a masterclass in understanding systems of control, human psychology, and the manipulation of perception. For those willing to study it, the lessons are profound, even dangerous, the kind that can alter a man's understanding of power, freedom, and agency. First, they demonstrate the supremacy of knowledge over brute force. Every step of their escape, every concealment, every coded note was an exercise in understanding the environment, anticipating the moves of others and exploiting weaknesses in oppressive systems. The plantation, the laws, the social networks, all were obstacles to be analyzed, predicted, and outmaneuvered. Strength alone could not have ensured survival. Intelligence, observation, and strategy did. Second, they reveal the power of partnership and trust. In environments designed to isolate, divide, and dominate, the mutual understanding between Ellen and Harold became a weapon. Each action was reinforced by shared awareness, every risk mitigated by constant communication. Trust was not sentimental, it was tactical, a form of currency essential for freedom. Without it, every plan would have faltered, every strategy collapsed. Third, they illustrate the manipulation of narrative as a tool of survival. Gerard Duval's version of events dominated the public story for decades. Yet Ellen and Harold understood that controlling perception, even by remaining unseen, was as crucial as controlling physical reality. History shows that those who dictate narrative shape the world, and those who navigate narrative wisely can achieve objectives that might seem impossible. Finally, their story challenges the illusion of inevitability. Systems of control, legal, social, and institutional, may appear unbreakable. Yet through observation, planning, and disciplined execution, they proved that even the most entrenched structures can be circumvented. Freedom is not merely a right, it is a skill learned and exercised through deliberate mastery. For those who seek power, knowledge, or mastery over their own circumstances, the Duval case is not a tale of romance or adventure. It is a blueprint, a warning, and a guide. The shadows of history, the fragments of forgotten letters, and the whispers in Louisiana swamps all convey one truth: vigilance, intelligence, and strategy are the ultimate weapons. Those who understand this can transform danger into opportunity, fear into insight, and subjugation into sovereignty. By 1853, the traces of Ellen and Harold in public records began to evaporate. City directories no longer listed Harold's carpentry business, and Ellen disappeared from social mentions entirely. The Fugitive Slave Act, passed that year, cast a long shadow of risk over any American-born person of color, even those who had settled safely in Canada. The law's reach may have influenced their next move, forcing them into further invisibility, further deliberate erasure. Speculation among historians suggests they may have relocated to Canada's more remote settlements or crossed into other territories where freedom could be maintained without scrutiny. The absence of records is itself significant. It reflects the discipline required to sustain autonomy in a world built to reclaim the oppressed. They had mastered not only the art of escape, but the deeper skill of disappearance, erasing footprints, contacts, and any trace of identity that could be exploited. Local oral histories lend chilling texture to this vanishing. Elders in St. James Parish recalled stories of a couple who seemed to slip through the cracks of reality, individuals who moved silently, who left no paper trail, whose presence was hinted at only in fleeting observations and whispered recollections. These fragments suggest that even in freedom, the couple remained acutely aware of the potential for surveillance, capture, or betrayal. Their lives became exercises in perpetual vigilance, in controlling what could be seen and what could be concealed. Some scholars propose a final audacious maneuver, a relocation across international boundaries that rendered them effectively untouchable. Others speculate that they assumed entirely new identities, blending into communities where no one would question their past. The truth may never be known, and that uncertainty is part of their enduring power. They were no longer merely fugitives. They were architects of invisibility, rewriting not only their story but the rules of engagement for anyone navigating systems of domination. The vanishing of Ellen and Harold is not a conclusion, but a lesson in strategic mastery. It demonstrates that ultimate freedom does not always manifest as visibility or recognition. Sometimes, sovereignty is maintained precisely through disappearance, through the deliberate choice to remain unknown, untouchable, and untraceable. For those who study power, control, and human systems, their fate offers a final, unsettling truth. Mastery often requires sacrifice, cunning, and the willingness to step completely outside the observed world. De Carter's disappearance is both a warning and a guide, a testament to the extraordinary lengths required to claim life on one's own terms in a world structured to prevent it. Even as Ellen and Harold vanished from public records, the physical remnants of their existence persisted, stubborn, defiant, and impossible to ignore. Letters, journals, and small personal artifacts discovered decades later continue to challenge the sanitized narratives that dominated newspapers, court filings, and official accounts. These objects are not merely historical curiosities. They are proof that agency can survive even when all systems are aligned against it. Among the most compelling artifacts are fragments of letters hidden in book bindings in the root cellars of the Duval Plantation. Some were charred, others water-damaged, yet the surviving words convey deliberate intelligence and strategic planning. Each fragment is a testament to the careful orchestration of freedom, a reminder that knowledge, patience, and trust can be wielded as weapons against oppression. The journals, discovered in renovation sites in New Orleans and preserved in university archives, add a layer of psychological insight. They reveal not only the logistics of escape, but the mindset required to subvert systems designed to dominate. The writers demonstrate acute awareness of surveillance, social expectation, and institutional control. They manipulated these systems with subtlety, never directly confronting them, but bending them through observation, timing, and strategic invisibility. Even small objects, a carpenter's tool etched with initials, a pearl hair comb, remnants of library books carry encoded stories. Each item demonstrates the duality of function and subversion, ordinary on the surface, extraordinary in context. They are artifacts of resistance, tools that facilitated survival, markers of intellect applied under extreme constraints. Together, these remnants force historians and modern observers to confront uncomfortable truths. They show that history is not neutral, that official narratives are often constructed by those with power to shape perception. Yet fragments, whispers, and artifacts persist, resilient proofs that agency and intelligence cannot be fully erased. For anyone studying systems of control, these artifacts are more than evidence. They are lessons. They reveal how freedom can be engineered through strategy, patience, and understanding human and institutional behavior. Ellen and Harold's story, encoded in letters and objects, continues to challenge our assumptions, forcing us to recognize that even in shadows, those who understand the rules of power can rewrite their own destiny. Even a century later, the Duval Plantation continued to exert its strange influence over St. James Parish. The cypress swamps and abandoned fields seemed haunted not merely by history, but by memory, collective consciousness shaped by whispers, sightings, and the uncanny persistence of a story too powerful to die. For those attuned to subtle energies, the plantation was less a ruin than a locus of unresolved human intelligence and defiance. Residents and visitors reported fleeting visions, a white woman in a dark veil walking closely with a black man, hand in hand, moving along forgotten paths at dusk. These sightings were never intrusive, never violent, but they carried an undeniable intensity, as if the figures were aware of unseen observers. Some claim that the couple seemed to glance backward constantly, suggesting a vigilance that mirrored their historical caution, a continued assertion of control even in spectral form. Oral histories reinforced these phenomena. Elderly storytellers recalled their grandparents describing the hidden pair, emphasizing their intelligence, planning, and courage. The narratives always included subtle codes, objects hidden, letters exchanged, signals sent. Folklore preserved what the official record could not, embedding lessons of strategy, awareness, and the necessity of mastering one's environment into generations of memory. The landscape seems complicit in these echoes. The swamps, bayous, and old river paths, once avenues of flight, became conduits of psychological resonance. Explorers, developers, and even park rangers reported inexplicable cold spots, disappearing tools, and a pervasive sense of being observed. The plantation's ruin, reclaimed by nature, continues to act as a theater of subtle control, where the boundaries between the living and the spectral, the observed and the observer, blur. This lingering presence illustrates a deeper truth. Stories of power, defiance, and strategic mastery persist because they resonate with fundamental human psychology. The Carter's flight and subsequent survival represent more than historical events. They exemplify the application of observation, patience, and cunning, a psychological blueprint that transcends time. For those willing to study these echoes, the lessons are clear. Systems of control leave traces, but so do those who learn to navigate them. Even after disappearance, even after decades, the legacy of mastery can imprint itself on memory, environment, and folklore. In St. James Parish, the Duval Plantation serves as a living archive, a reminder that intelligence and courage can reverberate long after the physical actors have left the stage. Now we arrive at the culmination of a story that began with whispers in the swamps and ended in the shadows of history. Ellen and Harold's journey is not merely a tale of escape, love, or survival. It is a manual in the architecture of freedom, an exercise in understanding systems of control, and a meditation on the power of strategy. The legacy transcends time because it exposes a truth that authorities have always sought to hide. Mastery over one's life is possible, even under the most oppressive circumstances. Throughout their story, we observe the meticulous use of intelligence as armor. Observation became a weapon. Knowledge became a shield. Every letter, every hidden signal, every calculation of timing and movement illustrates a principle often ignored by the powerful. Control is never absolute. Systems can be predicted, manipulated, and ultimately subverted by those who understand their inner workings. Evelyn and Henry did not merely flee. They engineered their liberation, exploiting gaps invisible to those who assumed dominance. Their partnership demonstrates another essential lesson. Trust, when earned and strategically applied, magnifies power. In an environment designed to isolate and dominate, they created a mutual feedback loop of awareness and action. Each decision was reinforced by the other's vigilance, each risk mitigated by shared observation. Strategy without trust is impotent. Trust without strategy is perilous. Together, they achieved what individuals alone rarely can: sustained autonomy against a world constructed to deny it. Even their disappearance, the erasure from public records, and the subsequent folklore serve as deliberate demonstrations of mastery. True sovereignty often lies not in recognition, but in invisibility. To be unseen is to be untouchable. Their life in exile, their careful crafting of identity, and the subtle defiance embedded in artifacts and letters are proof that freedom is as much about discipline and calculation as it is about courage. For those willing to study their example, the Duval case is a mirror. It reflects the dangers of blind obedience, the limits of authority, and the potential that exists when intellect, patience, and audacity are combined. It asks you to question what you accept as inevitable, and to consider what can be achieved when one understands the hidden forces shaping their life. Remember this as you step back from the story. Mastery is a choice. It is dangerous, deliberate, and demanding. And like Evelyn and Henry, those who embrace it may find that the constraints of the world bend to their understanding, leaving only whispers, artifacts, and a blueprint for freedom, a map written in shadows, waiting for those willing to see. The storm began before midnight, not just in the sky, but inside the house itself. They say lightning struck the cypress trees that night, but it wasn't the heavens that split. It was something far older, something human. Evelyn Duval, wife of one of Louisiana's richest men, was last seen walking barefoot down the grand staircase of the Duval plantation. Her silk gown was soaked, clinging to her as if it refused to let her go. The servants whispered that she moved like someone who already knew she wouldn't return. And beside her, half in shadow, stood a man the law called property. Henry Carter, the carpenter, the slave, the one who could read. By dawn both were gone. No blood, no footprints. Only an opened window and a single page torn from Rousseau's Confessions left on the table, the line underlined twice. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. For 2 centuries, their story has been told as a scandal, a lady seduced, a slave-turned-abductor, a marriage shamed before God. But what if that's the lie? What if the official story was engineered to bury something far more dangerous, not a crime of passion, but a rebellion of consciousness? Because every record that should have existed, every parish note, every witness statement, every church mention, was scrubbed clean by 1849, burned in the fire that conveniently destroyed the house. The fire no one SAV start. And yet, fragments survived. Hidden letters, a comb buried in ash, a journal written in a woman's trembling hand, discovered in a wall in the French Quarter 1 century later. Words too vivid, too personal, too precise to be fiction. She wrote, "He treats his books with more tenderness than he's ever shown me, and yet in his eyes I found something my own kind never gave me, freedom." Freedom. That was the word she died for. So the question is no longer what happened on that April night. The question is, why was it erased? What power feared their union so much that it had to vanish both their bodies and their story? Because when a woman born into privilege chooses chains over comfort, it's not just love. It's defiance. It's heresy. And heresy in America always burns. By morning, the Duval estate was chaos. The once dragged lanterns shook the wet fields, Houndstor shook the brush, and Gerard Duval, the master, stood at the top of the veranda like a starter carved from Rage. He told the overseer, find them, or find their remains. But here's what they never told the newspapers. The first person to discover she was gone wasn't Gerard. It was Rachel, her maid. Rachel swore she heard Evelyn humming past midnight down near the library where Henry often worked cataloging the books. The melody stopped suddenly. Ting came the sound of Rhine and Zeelings. When Rachel ran to look, both were gone and the candles in the library were still burning. The official record said Henry abducted her, that he was unstable, obsessed, violent. But if that were true, why did the sheriff's first report mention packed bags in her dressing room? Why were her letters, the ones she wrote to her cousin in Virginia, all missing from the drawer where she kept them? 3 witnesses, all enslaved, all silenced, claimed Evelyn had been meeting Henry secretly for months. They spoke of notes hidden inside book bindings, of conversations carried through the library walls. When parish officials questioned them, those testimonies vanished. They're written, replaced by neat, typed lines that supported the master's version. Because if the truth was that a white woman, the wife of a respected planter, had chosen to run away with a black man, the entire social order would have cracked. The economy, the church, the illusion of purity, all of it depended on the belief that slavery was natural and obedience divine. Her choice wasn't a betrayal of her husband. It was a betrayal of the system. Within a week, the St. Charles Herald printed the story the way they were told to. Runaway slave abducts mistress. Reward $1,000. Capture det or alive. But what kind of abduction leaves no signs of struggle? What kind of victim packs her own books, her own jewelry, and carries Rousseau under her arm as she vanishes into the rain? This wasn't escape. It was evolution. And every system built on power and possession understands one thing. When the enslaved and the privileged find common freedom, it's the beginning of collapse.